Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build a Star War. And which Star War would that be, Herbert? I hear you not asking because you can already see the box. The AT-ST by Bandai in 1/48th scale. That's which Star War I'm building, the box for which looks rather nice. And inside the box, well, I made a separate video for that, which goes into much more depth than I'm going to here. If you haven't seen it, there's a link to that video in the description and in the card at the upper right corner of the screen now. In brief, the plastic in this kit looks really nice and is very neat. I can say that there is only minimal cleanup required, and everything goes together with no real issue. Okay, the idea of doing separate what's in the box videos is to save time, so less waffling, Herbert, and more building. The instructions want construction to begin with the middle body section, I guess you might call it. The first thing to do here is glue these tube things into the lower half of the body. The guide pins on these are different sizes, so you can't really put them on backwards. Not that you want to do that, do you? These will later become the mounting holes for the legs, so they are kind of important. After those are in, it's time to put the top half of the midsection on. That's what I'll call it, I think. Will I stick to that? Who knows? Like most of the parts on this model, there are guide pins to ensure correct positioning, so this is very easy. That can be followed with this upper part, which, because of the handy dandy guide pins, is just as easy to install as the previous part. It does need a little bit of pressure, which isn't really surprising or uncommon, and I'm sure you can manage. That part is followed by this front part. Not a lot to say about this. It goes in just as easily as all the previous parts and looks very fronty. Next come these little detail-y things, which seem to be some kind of disc on a bracket. Its function is unknown. I suppose because this is a Star Wars model, it doesn't really have a function other than to look cool. There's one of these for either side of the model. On the rear, I attach this part which has what seem to be vents of some sort on it. This easily mounts onto the guide pins. The detail in the vent parts here is quite fine looking, and I was rather impressed. Then comes this, whatever it is, greebly, which is easy to install. This kind of thing makes me wonder what the original model maker was imagining that these parts were meant to be. I have no idea, of course, but I do know that they're simple and easy to get into place, and there's one of these for both sides of the assembly. Same with this thing. I did have to use my knife to push it into place properly. Next is an optional part. It appears to be some kind of cover over a something. Personally, I think it looks better on, so that's how I've built it. I add glue after installing the part. Tamiya extra thin will seep into the gaps nice and easily, and will bond the plastic together very well. Next comes this rear part. I guess it's a shroud that goes around those vents. This should be installed after you make a decision on the previous optional cover part. Now it's time to install this hose, or are these things cables? Whatever they are, I was impressed with these little pieces. Not only do they look good, but there's also pretty much no cleanup required. Often parts like these will have a very obvious mold line. Not in this kit though. They're pretty easy to install too. Maybe a little bit fiddly here and there, but nothing overly challenging. With the first cable installed, I then add this shield thingy. I guess that's what it is anyway. I have already said this a lot, but this was very easy to get into place, and looks quite nice. Then comes this cover, I guess. I glued this in and it didn't quite look centered, so I nudged it around a bit until it looked better. This is one of the few parts where there's this much play in the fit. It looks good in the end though. Okay, back to the hose or cable installation. These two were kind of interesting in that they share a mounting hole. The ends with the tab both go into the same rectangular hole on the bottom, which did kind of confuse me for a moment, but only a moment. There's a tiny bit of fiddliness in getting these on, but it's not too bad. When they're in place, I add some glue. I'd rather they didn't fall out. That would be quite inconvenient. Then comes another shieldy thingy. This is, unsurprisingly, just as easy to install as the previous one. It's looking good, but there's still a couple of cables left to install. These two short pieces going into this box are pretty easy to install, though one of them does seem to lead to nowhere. I was a bit confused by this, and thought about doing something to it so it makes sense, but I guess I forgot because I ended up leaving it like this. Oh well, maybe that's how it's meant to be. After that, I install these, I guess you might call them upper shieldy bits. They do kind of look like mud guards, but there are no wheels to throw mud up there, so whatever they are, they're simple to install and look good. Now it's leg time. Never skip leg time. That's what they say, isn't it? I wouldn't know, I always skip leg time. The first step is to sandwich the loopy bit of this long flexible thin part between those two leggy bits. The guide pins help with this, obviously. This assembly should be movable, so be careful with the glue. I apply the glue to the opposite ends from the moving parts, because I do want it to not come apart, but having the moving part movable will greatly aid in future steps. Before we get to that though, this upper leg part needs to be built. This round thing should go in here. I'm pretty sure if you put it in backwards, the other part won't go into place, so I would suggest not doing that. A little pressure and the parts go together pretty nicely. Then, glue, which will make sure that it stays together nicely. I then add glue to the little tabs on the flexible bit of the previous assembly, and join it to the leg bit we just assembled. Here's the best bit. Boing. Then comes this outer part. I know, real descriptive, right? The parts are easy to get together. You can see how the thin bit being movable is quite helpful here. To stop future movement though, I add glue. There's another outer part that goes on the other side, and this is just as simple to install as the other one. You might be surprised to learn. No, you probably wouldn't be surprised, would you? At any rate, the result is quite leggy, but there is yet more leg to come. Later. Unless you count feet as legs, because I'm installing the feet now. The base and what is mostly going to be internal foot parts go together with the bottom of the leg sandwiched between them, which is simple enough. I then take the upper foot part and install what I'm pretty sure is a fence or wire cutter, which looks like a Cullen hedgerow cutter that you might see on an Allied tank, and that is probably what was used by the model makers on the movie. This part can be left unglued so that it's movable, but it won't stay in place until the upper part goes on, so I installed that next. Our old friend Pressure needed to make a return for this, but it wasn't that hard to get on. The lower foot part goes on next, and there's not a whole lot to say about this. It is quite simple. Obviously this is followed by the upper foot part. This did need a fair bit of pressure to get it to go into place. In fact, I had to put the part on my desk and press down on it. I mean, that's not thousands of tons of pressure or anything like that, but it was still quite a bit. If you're not sure about this, I would suggest adding glue after putting it together, just so that the parts don't bond together halfway installed. That would be annoying. That's the lower part of the leg done, and it sits nicely on the base. We've done a lot of leg already, but it's not quite finished, so let's build the uppermost part of the leg now. There's another mounting socket thing part, and this one goes in this way. The shape on the inner end of it will limit the movement of the leg part that gets attached to it. Then the other half of this goes on, sandwiching that sockety bit in between. There's a tiny ring thing that goes onto this pin here. These are obviously prone to flying away and getting lost, but fortunately I didn't lose any of them. Next comes this whatever it is. The part goes into place easily enough, though the round bit in the centre looks, well, off-centre. I'm not sure if it should be like that, but it is, so let's move on. Then comes this, I guess you might call it a joint cover or something. This is keyed, but it looks like you could put it around either way. The slots in the front of this part need to be more towards the top, so be sure that you put it on the right way up. That way this next part will also go on the right way up. And that is the upper leg part, or thigh, completed. This can then be connected to the lower leg. Unsurprisingly, a little bit of pressure was needed here, but it will stay together with friction. You could of course glue it into place, but if you are going to do that, I'd suggest that you wait until the rest of the model is done and you've got it posed how you want it. There's another two of these tiny ring parts that need to be installed, and while they are certainly a bit fiddly owing to their small size, they're certainly not impossible to get into place. Though every time I installed one of these I was worried about it falling on the floor and vanishing forever. Then this cover thing goes on the inside of the leg at the, I guess you might call this the knee joint. I tried to glue this in such a way that it wouldn't bond the moving parts into place. The leg is complete now, so we have to put together the thing that connects the leg to the body, whatever that's called. This involves two similar looking peg parts. They're not exactly the same though, and if you're paying attention, you can see that. Though you shouldn't worry too much about that. The guide pins are differently sized, so you can't really build this the wrong way around. The two pin parts should be sandwiched between the two bar parts, whatever you might call them. As you can see, I'm being careful to avoid getting the glue on the moving parts. There's a ring doodad that goes over the end of one of the peg parts, and this is pretty simple to install. Then I press that assembly into the top of the leg part. The end with the ring goes into the leg, but I don't think it would fit anyway if you were to try putting it on the other way. The other end obviously goes into the body part. These parts will stay together with friction well enough, though I expect if you constantly move the parts, eventually the fit is going to get loose. You can see that there is quite a lot of movement and flexibility with these parts, so you could probably do some very interesting stuff in regards to how you pose this model. Next, I put together this. It probably has some sort of fancy Star Wars name, but I don't know what it is. At any rate, it's the part that joins the body with the upper head part, or cockpit, I don't know. Knowing what the various parts are is obviously not my forte, which is probably not surprising to anybody. Either way, this part goes together really nicely, and I glue it in place on top of the body section. Nice and simple. Now it's time to build the upper section. The instructions say that the first step is to install the crew figures. I feel like it would be a better idea to paint these separately, and I'm pretty sure that if I leave the roof off, it won't be too hard to install the crew after painting. These crew figures do look rather rigid and stiff and quite robotic, but that's okay. I'm sure they'll look fine when there's only limited vision of them looking in through the front windows or roof hatch. So, after test fitting, I take the crew figures and put them aside. Then I install the rear wall of the cockpit. The guide pins make this very easy to get into place correctly. That's the sort of thing guide pins are known for after all. Then come the two side parts. It doesn't really show on the video here, but I did find this a little bit confusing to get together. Maybe I'm just not good at using my brain, but it did stump me for a couple of minutes. I did get it together eventually, as you can see, so it can't really be that hard. Next comes the bottom of the cockpit. At the moment, all we need to do is install the part that the rest of the ATST will connect to. This is simple enough to do, but you won't be able to do it after the lower part is installed, which is what I did next. The part does go on, obviously, but a little more pressure than usual was needed. Next, I glue the forward part of the cockpit, with all of the controls and stuff, into the front of the cockpit, the external cockpit part. You know what I mean. That assembly can then be pressed into place on the rest of the cockpit. It was a little bit fiddly to get the parts to line up, but as you can see, I obviously got there. I then glue the rear panel on, which has 4 big mounting knobs. These make for a very nice fit. Of course, a little pressure helps as well. I follow that with this side plate thing. This looks like it has a little hatch for stowage or something. Good luck reaching it from ground level though. There is of course another one of these for the left side of the model too. I then install this grill part at the back of this thing, which I'm led to believe is meant to be an air conditioning system. Or at least that's what something I read about ATSTs said. That part can then be glued onto the top towards the rear of the roof part, where it fits nicely. I then install the hatch ring, for lack of better words, which has keying to make sure that you don't put it on all wibbly wobbly. The mounting part for the hatch should be towards the rear, just in case it wasn't obvious. Once that's on, I glue this railing thing into the 4 mounting holes intended for it. The inward angled parts should be towards the front. The instructions want the roof to be installed at this point, and if you don't plan on painting the interior, that would be fine. I do though, so I'm leaving the roof off. You can press the roof part into place and then remove it though, so if you don't glue it down, that's not really a big issue. Still, I'm leaving it off for the rest of the build anyway. Next, I install a pair of, I guess they're armor plates. There's one for either side at the lower front here, and there's no real issue in getting them into place. Then, there's another pair of armoured plates for the upper rear sides. Also quite simple to install. I add a bit of extra glue around the edges of these parts to minimize gaps and make sure that they stay in place. The weapon mounts, I guess you might call them, go on next. I think it's a bit odd that there's so many mounting slots for this part. To me it seems a bit unnecessary, but I'm sure there's a reason for it. Either way, it's not at all tricky to install these, and there's one for each side. Then comes, well, I guess it's more weaponry mounting, or equipment mounting. There's one of these for either side as well. Now for some more hoses. I don't know if they're actually hoses or cables, and I don't suppose it really makes that much of a difference. That's probably just really annoyed some obsessive Star Wars nerd who's dedicated their life to Star Wars cabling and hoses. Oh well. What really matters is these parts go into place pretty easily, and again, I'm really impressed by how little cleanup they needed. Back to the roof. I installed the hatch because, for whatever reason, it couldn't be installed with the rest of the roof bits. There is of course a different part if you want to model this closed. I've obviously chosen open, because if I'm going to paint the interior, I would like to be able to look in there. Makes sense, right? For the same reason, I'm also installing the covers for the front windows in the open position. Again, different parts are included for the closed version. It looks much more interesting to have them open in my opinion, even if the interior wasn't being painted. Assembling the chin-mounted gun comes next. First, onto this duva, I glue the part with two small, I guess they're blasters. I glue the main blaster barrels, which come as one piece, into the left half of the mounting bracket part, and then I sandwich the smaller assembly I just built in between that and the right half of the mounting bracket. A little pressure to squeeze it all together and it's done. Very blastery. Or I'm assuming they're blasters anyway. Then there's another bracket into which that gun assembly can be clipped. You could glue that solidly in place if you like, but maybe it's nice to have movable guns. That assembly can then be pressed into place here in the appropriate location. Heh. Boing. I'm still a mature adult. Next, I assemble the thing for the left side of the cockpit. I think this is actually meant to be a sensor cluster or something like that and not weapons, but my knowledge of Star Wars is quite limited and it could be both. It's not really important as long as you get the bits glued together in the proper way. This was a little bit fiddly really, not enragingly so by any stretch of the imagination, but I was a bit concerned that I would accidentally break some of those thin rod bits. There's a doodad that goes onto the mounting arm on one side. You can't really see it in the video, but there's keying so that it only goes one way. On the opposite side to that there's a shield. I guess you don't really want these bits getting shot at, though I don't think this shield is going to do a whole lot. That assembly can then be installed on the left side of the model. This isn't keyed, so you can position it how you like, but it probably makes the most sense to have it facing forward. I add some glue so that it stays there, and now I have to be careful with the model, because that looks kind of delicate, and I would really prefer not to break it off. I then glue a few tubey bits together, and they are pretty simple to assemble. Unfortunately, I filmed it in the wrong mode, so the colour looks a bit weird. Sometimes I wish I knew what I was doing. Anyway, those parts make what I'm led to believe is a grenade launcher. It, unsurprisingly, goes on the weapon mount on the right side of the model, and I glue it into place. And with that, the AT-ST is pretty much completed. I didn't film myself actually putting the cockpit onto the lower half of the model, but as you can see in these end clips, I did actually do that. Also, for funsies, here's the completed Bandai AT-ST next to the Tamiya M10 Achilles in the same scale that I recently built. I like that this gives an idea of how big the AT-ST is meant to be, though I guess the movies do that too. Anyway, the model is complete and I have to say that I really enjoyed building it. It was my first Bandai kit, and I had been told by a number of people that they're quite good, so I wasn't expecting it to be bad or anything, but I was quite impressed with how neat all of the parts are and how well they go together. There was still a little bit of cleanup work required, but not much at all, and really you could probably actually get away without doing any, and the mold lines would mostly not be very obvious. Obviously, I'm not actually suggesting that you don't remove the mold lines, because it's always going to look better without them. I'm just saying that they're very minor. Also, I'm saying that this is definitely not going to be my last Bandai kit. I don't have any more in my stash, but sooner or later I will pick up some more. For those interested, I did build this as part of the Sci-fi group build that was taking place on my Discord server when I started the build. That was a while ago though, and that group build has now ended. But you can see the video of the completed, and in my case, not so completed models. Unless I've been a huge slacker, you should be able to see that video now, and if not, very soon. Links will be in the description below. That does mean that I've been painting this model. It isn't completed yet, but it will be sometime soon. So do keep an eye out for that video. Eventually, links will also be in the description for that. Some things I like about this kit, other than the fact that the completed model looks awesome, and that it was easy to build, is that you can pose the model in a wide variety of positions. You could do a lot of cool or funny things if you wanted to. I quite like that sort of thing. Also, I like that the steps in the instructions were broken down into small bite-sized chunks. I mean, don't actually bite the instructions, they're not for eating. But I do like small steps. They sort of stop things from being done too early or in the wrong way and messing up future steps. It's also pretty helpful that the movable parts can stay together with friction, but can be pulled apart without any damage. That means you can break the model down into components that can be painted separately, and that's what I've done. Okay, so what do you think of this ATST? Have you built this kit yourself? Or maybe some other ATST kit? If so, maybe you would like to share some pictures of your work over on my Discord server. That would be cool. Okay, so building this kit was quite fun, and, like almost everything I make a video about, I did stream that build. It was a good time, and I want to say thank you to the people who were in chat for those streams. You made it even more enjoyable. If you want to join me as I glue bits of plastic together, head on over to twitch.tv/Herbert_Erpaderp, or follow the convenient link below. Give me a follow, and then when I'm live, come and say hi. That would be great. And if you haven't already, why not subscribe, follow, ring the bell, become a patron or YouTube member, and all the other things you do on the internet. Also, if you're feeling really helpful, please share this video with your friends or anybody you think might get something out of it. Links to all of my things are in the description below, and, as always, I shall return soon. So, until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.